3 whiskeys and a pinch of gold, she's yours. Thomas's voice rasped beyond the tent, his words a blade twisting in Rachel's gut as he bartered her life to rough-voiced smugglers. She sat hunched on a creaking cot, clutching a threadbare shawl, her knuckles whitening as the sting of betrayal burned hotter than the prairie's relentless sun. The wedding dress, draped in shadows, sagged against the wall, its faded silk whispering of promises broken long ago. With a stifled sob, Rachel eased through the tent's flap, heart pounding, and fled into the vast Cheyenne night, her footsteps soft but resolute, chasing a freedom she could barely imagine. Rachel, a young white woman in her early 20s, was raised in the stifling grip of a father who ruled her life with an unyielding hand, viewing her as little more than a tool for his gain. Forced into a marriage with Thomas Sinclair, a man whose charming promises masked a brutal, whiskey-soaked temper, she traded one cage for another, enduring years of betrayal and beatings that left scars both seen and unseen. Now, stranded in a desolate tent on the unforgiving Cheyenne plains, she faces the ultimate degradation, being sold by her own husband to smugglers for a handful of gold and a few bottles of liquor. Isolated, with no family to turn to and no allies in this foreign land, Rachel's world is one of relentless hardship, her spirit battered but not broken, as she clings to a flickering hope of reclaiming her dignity and forging a path to freedom. Rachel's hands trembled as she pushed aside the tent flap, her heart pounding so fiercely she feared it would give her away. Thomas's drunken laughter mixed with the low, rough voices of smugglers outside, his cruel words about trading her for 3 bottles of whiskey and a handful of gold still burning in her mind like a fresh wound. She crouched low, slipping behind a jagged boulder near the camp's edge, her breath catching as she saw gold coins glint in the firelight. The sight twisted her stomach, her pain sharp and raw, as if her entire existence had been reduced to a cheap bargain. She bolted into the darkness, her tattered dress catching on thorns, her bare feet stinging against the rocky ground. Each step felt like a silent scream, her body driven by a desperate need to escape. A sharp bark from the camp's dogs froze her mid-stride. She had been spotted. Rachel stumbled, her knee slamming into the dirt, panic clawing at her chest as she scrambled up. A shadow loomed ahead, and she stifled a gasp as a tall figure stepped into her path. "Stop," a calm, firm voice said. It was Nakoa, a Cheyenne warrior, his dark eyes scanning her with quiet intensity. He pointed to a ravine, warning of deadly cliffs beyond. "Come with me," he offered, extending a calloused hand. Rachel hesitated, her pulse racing, distrust battling her fear of the smugglers closing in. Thomas's betrayal had taught her to trust no one, but the dog's howls grew louder. Swallowing hard, she nodded and followed Nakoa into the shadows, her body tense with the fear of pursuit. A faint hope flickered in her heart with his help, but the threat of capture kept her on edge. Her legs burned as Nakoa led her through the night to a shallow cave, its entrance hidden by scraggly brush. He handed her a small pouch of water and a strip of dried meat, his movements steady despite their hurried escape. Rachel took them with shaking hands, her throat tight as she tried to speak. "My husband, Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He sold me." The words spilled out, raw and bitter, each one a fresh cut to her pride. Nakoa sat across from her, his face half-lit by moonlight, listening without judgment, his silence easing the ache in her chest. He nodded slowly, saying he had seen men like Thomas before, smugglers who traded lives for profit, but admitted he didn't know how deep their network ran. Rachel's curiosity stirred, and she asked about his people, the Cheyenne. Nakoa's voice softened as he spoke of their loyalty, their fight to protect their own, his words painting a world so different from the one that had betrayed her. She watched him wrap a cloth around a fresh cut on his arm, his care for himself mirroring the kindness he showed her. yet her heart remained guarded, scarred by years of broken trust. A distant clatter of hooves snapped her back to reality. Smugglers were searching the plains. Nakoa pulled her deeper into the cave, pressing a finger to his lips as they crouched in the dark. The sound of riders grew closer, their curses echoing, then faded. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, her body pressed against the cold stone, Nakoa's steady presence the only thing keeping her from crumbling. She began to trust him, his quiet strength anchoring her. But the ever-present danger of capture kept her nerves taut. Rachel jolted awake in the cave, her scream caught in her throat as Thomas's sneering face lingered from a nightmare. Morning light filtered through the entrance, and Nakoa was already up, sharpening a knife. Her panic must have shown, because he glanced over, his voice gentle but firm. "You're safe, for now." He showed her how to erase their tracks, brushing dirt over footprints and snapping twigs to blend with the ground. Rachel tried to mimic him, her hands clumsy, her mind reeling as she asked why he'd risk so much for a stranger. "No one should be sold like an animal," Nakoa said, his eyes meeting hers with a conviction that stirred something deep within her. She felt small, useless, admitting she knew nothing of surviving in the wild, her life, until now, confined to obeying others. Nakoa didn't judge. Instead, he led her to a rushing river, teaching her to cross by gripping rocks against the current. Halfway through, the water surged, nearly sweeping her away. But Nakoa's strong grip pulled her to safety, her heart racing with both fear and gratitude. On the far bank, Rachel's blood ran cold as she spotted a knitted scarf. Her scarf, one she'd made for Thomas, tangled in the brush, a sign the smugglers were close. Her stomach churned, the past clawing at her, but Nakoa knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Fear is real, but you're stronger than it." His words sparked a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She nodded, clenching her fists, determined to keep moving forward. Rachel began to grasp survival skills, her resolve hardening, but the scarf's discovery deepened her fear of Thomas's pursuit. The scarf's weight lingered in Rachel's thoughts as she and Nakoa pressed deeper into the Cheyenne plains, the morning sun casting long shadows across the scrubland. They stumbled upon an abandoned smuggler's camp, its fire pit cold, littered with broken bottles and scraps of rope. Rachel's stomach twisted at the sight, her mind flashing to Thomas's deal. She kicked through the debris, her foot catching on a crumpled scrap of paper. She unfolded it with trembling hands, revealing a scrawled note about a delivery at a place called Red Canyon. The words blurred as her heart raced, the reality of her worth as a traded good sinking in. Nakoa studied the note, his brow furrowing, and said it might point to where the smugglers traded their victims. Rachel's throat tightened, a memory surfacing of Thomas muttering about a fort deal in his drunken haze. She shared it with Nakoa, her voice barely above a whisper, the shame of her past life choking her. He suggested heading to his Cheyenne village for answers, his calm certainty steadying her fraying nerves. As they walked, Rachel opened up about her father's iron control, how he'd shaped her into a pawn. Nakoa listened, then spoke of his mother, a woman who defied tradition to protect her family, his words kindling a spark of admiration in Rachel. A sudden twang broke their talk, a Cheyenne arrow thudding into the ground nearby, a warning from unseen scouts. Nakoa raised his hands, calling out in his language, but Rachel's pulse spiked, her body tensing as she realized how far she was from safety. The suspicion about Thomas's ties to a larger network grew, but so did the dangers surrounding her. Nakoa's quick words to the unseen Cheyenne scouts eased the tension, and soon they were trudging toward his village, the arrow's warning still heavy in Rachel's mind. The village emerged from the horizon, a cluster of teepees framed by rolling hills. Nakoa introduced her to Lila, his sharp-eyed sister, whose gaze pierced Rachel like a blade. Lila's questions were blunt, probing Rachel's intentions, but she allowed her to stay, her voice grudging yet fair. Rachel joined the women in their work, hauling water and kneading dough, her hands clumsy but grateful for the rhythm that dulled her fear. Hawk, a young warrior with a quick grin, teased her about her pale skin, his laughter lightening the weight in her chest. At night, by a crackling fire, Rachel poured out her story to Lila, her voice breaking as she recounted Thomas's betrayal. Tears stung her eyes, but Lila's steady nod gave her strength. Lila shared that the Cheyenne had lost kin to smugglers, her words heavy with grief, making Rachel's own pain feel less solitary. The village elders gathered, and after a long discussion they gave Rachel a new name, Ahioka, meaning bringer of hope. The name felt like a gift, a chance to shed the broken pieces of her past. Ahioka clung to this new identity, her heart warming to the sense of belonging, but the shadow of the smuggler's network loomed, a reminder that her fight was far from over. The name Ahioka still felt foreign on her tongue when a shout rippled through the village at dawn. Thomas had come, his horse kicking up dust as he demanded his lost wife. Ahioka's stomach dropped, her hands shaking as Lila pulled her behind a tipi, whispering for her to stay calm. Nakoa faced Thomas, his voice steady, refusing to yield. Ahioka's fear surged, urging her to flee again, but Nakoa's glance held her in place, his quiet strength anchoring her. Thomas's threats grew louder, promising to return with soldiers, his sneer cutting into her resolve. Hawk, fists clenched, begged Nakoa to let him drive Thomas off, but Nakoa shook his head, wary of bloodshed. Ahioka's chest tightened, the thought of hiding forever unbearable. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm, clutching a knife from the village. "I'm not yours," she told Thomas, her words slicing through the air. His laugh was cruel, mocking her defiance, but he mounted his horse and rode off, vowing retribution. The village fell silent, Ahioka's breath ragged as she lowered the knife, her body trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. Nakoa's hand brushed her shoulder, a silent approval, but the promise of Thomas's return hung heavy, a storm brewing on the horizon. Ahioka felt stronger, her defiance a spark igniting her will, but the looming threat of his vengeance kept her heart pounding. Thomas's retreating hoofbeats still echoed in Ahioka's mind as she and Nakoa ventured beyond the village, driven by a need to uncover the truth behind his threats. They moved through a narrow gully when a faint whimper stopped them cold. Huddled behind a cluster of rocks was Clara, a frail woman with matted hair and haunted eyes, her wrists raw from ropes she'd escaped. Ahioka knelt beside her, offering a sip of water, her own heart aching at the sight of another woman broken by the same cruelty she'd fled. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke of being kidnapped from a nearby town, of women like her sold to work in distant mines, their lives traded for profit. Ahioka's chest tightened, her suspicion confirmed. Thomas wasn't just a cruel husband, but a cog in a vast machine. Nakoa, crouching nearby, recalled the note from the smuggler's camp, his voice low as he suggested the local military fort might be involved. Clara, though shaking, nodded when Ahioka asked if she'd help find proof, her fear outweighed by a flicker of defiance. They planned to track a smuggler deal at Red Canyon, a place Clara had overheard her captors mention. Ahioka's anger surged, her hands clenching as she thought of Thomas's sneering face, but fear gnawed at her too, the scale of the danger sinking in. She exchanged a glance with Nakoa, his steady nod urging her forward. The truth about the smuggling ring was coming into focus, but it pulled them closer to a perilous edge. Under the cover of dusk, Ahioka, Nakoa, and Clara crept toward Red Canyon, their breaths shallow as they hid among jagged rocks overlooking a clearing. Below, Jeb, a burly smuggler Ahioka recognized from Thomas's camp, handed over a group of bound women to a uniformed soldier, their transaction cold and mechanical. Ahioka's stomach churned, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to scream. She caught the name Colonel Marcus, in their muttered exchange, the soldier's tone deferential, as if Marcus held power beyond the fort. Nakoa's eyes narrowed, memorizing the location, already planning to infiltrate the fort for answers. Clara, pressed close to Ahioka, began to tremble, her whispered words revealing memories of her own capture, the pain raw in her voice. Ahioka squeezed her hand, her own fear mingling with resolve, determined to protect Clara and the others. A twig snapped under Clara's foot, and a guard's head whipped toward their hiding spot. Nakoa signaled to run, and they scrambled through the rocks, branches tearing at their clothes. A shout rang out, but the darkness swallowed their trail. They collapsed in a thicket, Clara clutching a shallow cut on her arm, her face pale but resolute. Ahioka's heart pounded, the name Marcus burning in her mind, a new piece of the puzzle. But their close call left her shaken, the risks of their mission starkly clear. As they caught their breath and moved towards safer ground, a faint rustle in the brush made Ahioka freeze. An old man emerged, his weathered face lined with scars, his eyes sharp despite his tattered clothes. Nakoa tensed, but didn't draw his knife, sensing no threat. The man spoke first, his voice gravelly, claiming he knew of the smuggling ring and had watched them from the shadows. He revealed he was once a soldier who tried to expose Colonel Marcus, the mastermind behind the trade, protected by a powerful general named Amos. Ahioka's breath caught, the scope of the corruption hitting her like a blow, her hands shaking as she realized the enemy was far bigger than Thomas. The old man pulled a folded map from his coat, marking the fort's layout, and pressed it into Nakoa's hands, warning that Marcus was ruthless and Amos untouchable. Nakoa vowed to keep Ahioka safe, his voice steady, but his grip on the map tightened, betraying his own unease. The old man stepped back, vanishing into the night as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving Ahioka with a chill of awe and dread. She clutched the map's edge, her resolve hardening against the monstrous truth, but the weight of their new challenge pressed heavily on her heart, the path ahead fraught with danger. The old man's map weighed heavy in Ahioka's hands as she sat by the village fire, the flickering light casting shadows on her face. The fort loomed in her mind, a fortress hiding the truth about Marcus and his crimes. She spoke up, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach, suggesting she disguise herself as a traitor to slip inside and find proof. Lila's eyes widened, but she nodded, pulling Ahioka to her tipi to prepare. She handed her a worn dress and a basket of herbs, coaching her to speak boldly, like the women who bartered at the fort's gates. Ahioka practiced the words, her tongue stumbling, but Lila's firm encouragement pushed her to try again. Nakoa watched from the doorway, his jaw tight with worry, yet he murmured his trust in her, his faith bolstering her courage. Hawk, ever eager, slung a bow over his shoulder and volunteered to guard her from outside, his grin hiding his own nerves. Clara, still shaken from their last escape, shook her head, her eyes downcast, unable to face the fort's dangers again. Ahioka understood, squeezing her hand before turning to practice her walk, forcing her shoulders back to mask the fear churning inside. Before dawn, the village gathered, their soft chants rising in a prayer for strength. Ahioka clutched the map, her heart pounding with the audacity of their plan, knowing one misstep could end it all. The tingle of hope mixed with dread as they set out, the fort's shadow drawing closer. Ahioka's basket of herbs swung against her hip as she approached the fort's gates, the guard's eyes raking over her. She forced a smile, her voice loud as she offered her wares, but one soldier's lingering stare made her pulse spike. She pushed past, heart thumping, weaving through the bustling yard toward the officers' quarters the old man had marked. Nakoa and Hawk waited beyond the walls, hidden in the brush, their presence a distant comfort as she navigated alone. Inside a dim office, she found a ledger on Marcus's desk, its pages listing names of women, prices, and destinations. Her hands shook as she scribbled the details onto a scrap of cloth, each word a dagger of truth about the smuggling ring. Footsteps echoed outside, and Ahioka's breath caught as an officer entered. Thinking fast, she knocked her basket to the floor, herbs spilling as she apologized, her voice high and frantic. The officer grunted, waving her off, and she hurried out, the cloth tucked inside her dress. As she reached the gate, a cold gaze stopped her, Marcus himself watching from across the yard, his eyes narrowing. Ahioka forced her steps to stay even, slipping through the crowd, but her chest tightened with the certainty that he'd seen too much. She rejoined Nakoa and Hawk, the ledger's secrets burning in her pocket, but Marcus's suspicion hung like a noose, tightening with every moment. The fort's gates had barely faded behind them when a horn blared, and shouts of pursuit rang out. Marcus had raised the alarm. Ahioka's legs burned as she, Nakoa, and Hawk sprinted into the forest, branches snapping underfoot as bullets whizzed past. Hawk notched an arrow, firing back to slow the soldiers, his face set with fierce determination. Ahioka's foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, a soldier's boots pounding closer. Nakoa yanked her up, his grip firm, and pulled her into a thicket, their bodies pressed low in the underbrush. The soldiers' curses grew faint, passing by, but a scream pierced the air, Clara's voice. Ahioka's heart sank, realizing Clara had followed them, unable to stay behind, and now she was caught. Nakoa held Ahioka back as she strained to run after her, his whispered warning sharp with urgency. They waited, breathless, until the soldiers moved on, but Clara's absence carved a hollow in Ahioka's chest. She clutched the cloth with the ledger's secrets, guilt flooding her as she blamed herself for Clara's capture. Nakoa's hand rested on her shoulder, urging her to keep moving, but despair clung to her, the cost of their mission cutting deeper than she'd feared. Ahioka's heart ached with guilt as she and Nakoa stumbled back to the Cheyenne village, Clara's scream still ringing in her ears. The village fires glowed softly, but the weight of their failure pressed hard on her chest. She gathered the elders, her voice shaking as she recounted Clara's capture and the ledger's proof of Marcus's crimes. Lila stood, her eyes fierce, calling for the tribe to rally, her words igniting a spark of unity among the gathered faces. Hawk, his jaw set, slammed his fist on a log, proposing a bold strike on the smugglers' trading post at Red Canyon to free Clara and the others. Ahioka spread the copied ledger notes on the ground, her fingers tracing names and dates, pinpointing Marcus's reliance on a single supply route, a weakness they could exploit. Nakoa moved among the warriors, his voice calm but commanding, as he organized them to sharpen spears and string bows. Ahioka, haunted by Clara's fate, slipped away to write a letter detailing Marcus's crimes, sealing it for a trusted runner to deliver to a nearby town's newspaper, a safeguard if their plan failed. Alone by the fire, she knelt, whispering a prayer to steady her trembling hands, her resolve hardening like steel. The village buzzed with preparation, hope flickering anew, but the looming battle promised blood and danger, and Ahioka felt its shadow creeping closer. Under a moonless sky, the Cheyenne warriors crept toward Red Canyon, Ahioka leading the way with the old man's map clutched tight. Her heart pounded, but she forced her steps to stay sure, guiding the group through a narrow pass to the trading post. Nakoa moved like a shadow, silencing a guard with a swift strike, clearing the path to the camp's heart. Inside a makeshift pen, Ahioka spotted Clara among other women, their faces pale with fear, and her chest tightened with urgency. The warriors fanned out, cutting ropes and freeing the captives, but Jeb, the smuggler from before, roared in defiance, swinging a club. Hawk tackled him, pinning him to the ground with a grunt, his strength overpowering Jeb's thrashing. A sudden shout broke the chaos, Marcus himself stepping into the firelight, his soldiers fanning out to surround them. Ahioka's blood ran cold, but she stepped forward, her voice ringing as she accused him of trafficking women, her words sharp with the truth of the ledger. Marcus's eyes glinted with menace, but the freed women's murmurs of recognition bolstered her courage. The air crackled with tension, the rescue, a fragile victory. But Marcus's presence turned the night into a battlefield, and Ahioka braced for the fight ahead. Marcus's laugh cut through the clearing, cold and mocking, as he dismissed Ahioka as a foolish girl meddling in men's affairs. Her hands shook with fury, but she held up the cloth with the ledger's copied names, reading aloud the grim tally of his crimes, each word a defiance of his power. The warriors and captives stood firm, their silence a wall against his scorn. A new figure emerged from the shadows, General Amos, Marcus's superior, his face a mask of shock as Ahioka's accusations landed. Marcus spun, his voice shrill, claiming Amos knew of the trade and profited from it, his betrayal sparking chaos among the soldiers. Nakoa stepped in front of Ahioka, shielding her as a soldier raised his rifle. A shot rang out, and Nakoa staggered, blood blooming on his shoulder, his grunt of pain piercing Ahioka's heart. Hawk shouted, rallying the warriors to guide Clara and the other women into the trees, their escape a blur of motion. Ahioka's voice rose, demanding justice, her eyes locked on Amos, who stood frozen, caught between Marcus's lies and the truth. Nakoa leaned against her, his breathing labored, and she gripped his arm, fear and resolve warring within her. Marcus was cornered, his empire crumbling, but Nakoa's injury and Amos's indecision left Ahioka teetering on the edge of hope and despair. Ahioka's hands trembled as she supported Nakoa, his blood soaking her sleeve, while Amos ordered his men to bind Marcus's wrists. The general's face was grim, but his quick command to march Marcus back to the fort without a word of trial sent a chill through her. She caught Amos's glance, his eyes hard, and realized he meant to bury the truth to protect his own name. "You knew," Ahioka said, her voice sharp despite her fear, stepping forward as Nakoa leaned heavily against her. "You let this happen." Amos's lip curled, and he leaned close, his whisper cold. "Speak again, girl, and you'll regret it." She held his gaze, her heart pounding, refusing to back down. The warriors carried Nakoa to the village, where Lila worked swiftly, cleaning his wound, but his shallow breaths and feverish skin told a grim story. Lila pulled Ahioka aside, her voice low. "The fort won't punish Marcus. You need to tell the world." Ahioka nodded, her throat tight, and slipped the ledger's copied notes to a runner, bound for a nearby town's newspaper. She sat by Nakoa's side, holding his hand, his face pale under the firelight. "Stay with me," she whispered, tears burning her eyes as she prayed for his strength to hold. The village was quiet, Marcus in chains, but Amos's silence revealed a rotten system, and Ahioka's hope hung by a thread as Nakoa fought for life. Days later, the newspaper hit the towns, its bold headline exposing Marcus's trafficking ring, the ledger's details laid bare. Anger rippled through the plains, traders and townsfolk demanding justice, their voices too loud for Amos to ignore. He announced a public trial, his face tight with resentment, unable to dodge the pressure. Ahioka stood in the crowded fort courtyard, her voice steady as she recounted her escape, Thomas's betrayal, and the horrors of the smuggling trade. Clara, frail but resolute, stepped forward, her words halting but clear, confirming the names in the ledger, her testimony echoing Ahioka's. The crowd's murmurs grew, their outrage palpable, and the judge sentenced Marcus to life in prison, his smug mask finally cracking. Word came that Thomas had been caught in a nearby saloon, his drunken boasts leading to his arrest, his fate sealed by the same truth Ahioka had uncovered. "We did it," Clara said softly, gripping Ahioka's arm. But Ahioka's heart sank as she thought of Nakoa, still clinging to life in the village. The victory was real, Marcus and Thomas brought low, but Nakoa's fading strength cast a shadow over her triumph, and she hurried back, fear gnawing at her resolve. Ahioka rushed to Nakoa's side, finding him awake but weak, his eyes glassy with pain. The healer shook her head, her face somber, and Ahioka's chest tightened, dread washing over her. Nakoa's hand found hers, his grip faint but warm. "Keep fighting, Ahioka," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't let them win." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, unable to speak as he smiled, a faint curve of pride on his lips. "I'm proud of you," he murmured, his eyes softening before they closed, his breath stilling. Ahioka's sob broke the silence, her heart shattering as she clung to his hand, the weight of his loss crushing her. Lila and Hawk gathered the village, their faces etched with grief, and they prepared a warrior's funeral, piling stones around Nakoa's resting place under the open sky. Lila's voice was steady as she spoke of his courage, but Ahioka barely heard, her mind replaying his final words. She stood alone at dusk, vowing to honor his fight, to carry his strength in her own. The tribe chanted his name, their voices rising, and Ahioka felt a flicker of purpose through her pain. Nakoa's sacrifice, a fire that would guide her forward. Ahioka stood among the Cheyenne, Nakoa's funeral stones a silent anchor, when a runner brought news from a nearby town. Thomas had been arrested, caught boasting about his smuggling days in a saloon, unaware the tide had turned against him. The village buzzed, but Ahioka felt only a dull ache, her grief for Nakoa overshadowing any triumph. At the trial, Thomas slumped in chains, his eyes darting as he blamed Marcus for everything, his voice shrill and desperate. No one listened. The judge's face stone cold as evidence piled up. Ahioka faced him in the courtroom, her hands steady as she spoke of his betrayal, his sale of her life for whiskey and gold. "You broke me," she said, her voice low but clear. "But I'm not yours anymore." Thomas's sneer faltered, and the judge sentenced him to years in a distant prison, his name to rot in obscurity. Ahioka stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of her past lifting, though forgiveness remained out of reach. She walked back to the village, the plain stretching wide before her, Thomas's shadow fading into nothingness. His fate was sealed, a chapter closed, and Ahioka felt the first stirrings of freedom, her heart turning toward the future Nakoa had urged her to fight for. Back in the village, Ahioka joined a group clearing out a captured smuggler's cart, her hands sorting through papers when she found a leather-bound journal stamped with Marcus's initials. She opened it under the firelight, her breath catching as she read his meticulous notes, detailing bribes to judges and threats to silence officers. One entry described a confrontation with Amos, Marcus's veiled warnings ensuring the general's compliance. Ahioka's stomach churned, the depth of the corruption staggering her. She brought the journal to Lila, spreading its pages on a woven mat. "This could ruin them all," Lila said, her eyes sharp, urging Ahioka to send it to the newspapers that had broken Marcus's story. Ahioka hesitated, her fingers tracing the journal's edge, fear creeping in for the village's safety if powerful men retaliated. She thought of Nakoa's sacrifice, his call to keep fighting, and her resolve hardened. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice firm, and entrusted the journal to a runner, her heart racing with the risk. The truth about Marcus's web of control was unraveling, but the move pushed Ahioka deeper into a dangerous game. The journal's contents hit the presses, and soon Amos's name was splashed across headlines, his ties to Marcus under scrutiny. A week later, his horse thundered into the village, his face red with fury as he demanded to know who had leaked the journal. Ahioka stepped forward, her chin high, meeting his glare without flinching. "The truth's out, General," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "You can't hide anymore." Amos's hand twitched toward his pistol, his voice a growl. "You'll pay for this, girl." Hawk moved to Ahioka's side, his bow ready, his stance daring Amos to act. The village warriors gathered, their silence a wall of defiance, and Amos's bravado faltered, his power crumbling under their gaze. He spat a curse and rode off, but his threat lingered like smoke. Ahioka watched him go, her hands clenched, Nakoa's memory urging her to stand firm. "We'll be ready," she told Lila, her eyes scanning the horizon. The village stood stronger, Amos's influence waning, but the specter of his vengeance loomed, and Ahioka knew the fight was far from over. Amos's parting threat echoed in Ahioka's mind as she gathered the village elders, her voice firm as she proposed strengthening their defenses. She pointed out weak spots in the village's perimeter, urging the warriors to build higher barricades. Hawk took charge of the younger fighters, his shouts ringing out as he drilled them in archery and spear throwing, his energy infectious despite the grim task. Lila pulled Ahioka aside, teaching her how to negotiate with neighboring tribes, her words sharp but patient. "Speak from strength, but listen first," Lila said, guiding Ahioka through the art of alliance building. Ahioka organized night patrols, walking the village's edge herself, her eyes scanning the dark for any sign of trouble. Clara, her hands steadier now, worked with the women to dry meat and store grain, her quiet determination a comfort to Ahioka. The village moved as one, their shared purpose binding them, but tension hung heavy, every rustle in the grass a potential threat. As dawn broke, a scout rushed in, his breath ragged, reporting strange tracks near the river, too deliberate to be random. Ahioka's heart quickened, her fingers tightening around the knife at her belt. The village was ready, their defenses stronger, but the unknown danger sharpened her focus, the air thick with unease as they braced for what might come. Ahioka set out at first light, leading a small group to meet the Arapaho, a neighboring tribe known for their skilled riders. She stood before their leader, her voice steady as she spoke of the smuggling threat, urging a united stand to protect their lands. The Arapaho chief listened, his eyes narrowing, then agreed, but only if the Cheyenne shared their surplus grain. "We fight together, we eat together," he said, his tone firm but fair. Ahioka nodded, organizing a trade of wheat for Arapaho horses, her hands busy loading carts alongside the village women. Back at the village, both tribes sealed the alliance with a ceremony, their chants blending under the stars, a bond forged in shared resolve. As the fires died down, Hawk caught a stranger lurking near the camp, his clothes marked with Amos's insignia. Ahioka faced the spy, her voice cold as she demanded answers. He confessed Amos was planning an attack, his words spilling out under her unrelenting stare. She released him with a warning, her mind racing as she realized the danger was closer than she'd feared. The alliance with the Arapaho gave her hope, but Amos's scheme loomed large, a storm gathering on the horizon. The spy's confession sent a jolt through the village, and Ahioka called the elders to a council, her voice urgent as she relayed Amos's plan to send hired fighters. The elders' faces hardened, and they agreed to set a trap at the old Red Canyon trading post, a place Amos's men would likely strike. Hawk volunteered to lead the ambush, his eyes bright with determination. "We'll hit them before they know what's coming," he said, already mapping the canyon's choke points. Ahioka worked with the women to prepare the village for evacuation, guiding children and elders to a hidden valley, her heart heavy but her steps sure. Lila, scouting the outskirts, stumbled on a buried cache of smuggler weapons, knives and rifles, stashed by Marcus's men. She showed Ahioka, her voice low. This could turn the fight. They distributed the arms, refining their plan to lure Amos's mercenaries into the canyon's narrow pass. Ahioka stood before the warriors, her words steady as she outlined the trap, Nakoa's memory fueling her courage. The village was a hive of quiet preparation, every hand ready, but the air crackled with tension, the coming battle a test of their strength and unity. The stars were hidden as Hawk led the Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors to their positions in Red Canyon, his silhouette blending with the rocky walls. Ahioka crouched on a high ledge, her bow taut, watching the narrow pass where Amos's mercenaries would come. The trap was set, stakes sharpened and hidden in the brush. The mercenaries marched in, their lanterns bobbing, unaware of the eyes tracking them. Hawk signaled, and arrows flew, chaos erupting as the hired fighters stumbled into the spikes. Ahioka loosed her arrows, her hands steady despite her racing heart, aiming for the lanterns to sow confusion. The battle turned fierce, swords clashing against spears, and Hawk's shout of pain cut through the noise as a blade grazed his arm. Ahioka's breath caught, but Lila surged forward with a reserve team, her knife flashing as she drove the mercenaries back. "Keep them pinned," Lila called, her voice sharp, rallying the warriors. The enemy faltered, and soon a handful surrendered. Their leader, a scarred man, admitting Amos had hired them to crush the village. Ahioka bound the prisoners, her eyes fierce as she ordered them kept alive for testimony. The canyon fell silent, the victory hard won, but Hawk's wound needed care, and Ahioka felt the cost of their fight as she helped him limp back to the village. With the prisoners secured, Ahioka wasted no time, bundling the mercenaries' confession with Marcus's journal and sending it to a judge in a nearby town. She gathered witnesses, the captured mercenary trembling as he agreed to testify, his fear of Amos outweighed by the Cheyenne's resolve. Lila sat with Ahioka late into the night, sharpening her words for the courtroom, urging her to speak plainly but with fire. "Tell them what Nakoa died for," Lila said, her voice soft but firm. Hawk, his arm bandaged, pushed through his pain, vowing to stand with Ahioka. "I'll make Amos face what he did," he said, his eyes blazing. Ahioka wrote a letter to the townsfolk, pleading for justice, her pen scratching out Nakoa's story, Clara's suffering, and the village's fight. The judge responded, summoning Amos to a trial, and Ahioka's heart pounded as she prepared to face him again. Amos arrived at the fort, his uniform crisp, his smile smug as if untouchable. The village stood ready, their evidence strong, but the trial loomed like a storm, tension coiling in Ahioka's chest as she steeled herself for the confrontation. The courtroom buzzed with townsfolk as Ahioka took the stand, her voice clear as she detailed Amos's role in shielding Marcus, allowing women to be sold like cattle. The mercenary, pale and sweating, confirmed Amos had paid for the attack on the village. His words halting but damning, Hawk followed, his arms still slung, recounting the canyon battle, his voice steady as he described Amos's hired blades. Amos rose, his tone smooth, denying everything, claiming he'd been misled by Marcus. His story unraveled, contradictions piling up as the judge's eyes narrowed. The crowd grew restless, and the judge demanded more proof. Ahioka stepped forward, her hands steady as she presented Marcus's journal, its pages open to Amos's name, his complicity inked in Marcus's own hand. "He knew," Ahioka said, her voice cutting through the room, "and he did nothing." The judge's gavel fell, sentencing Amos to prison, stripping his rank. The crowd erupted, and Ahioka exhaled, the weight of years lifting. Amos's power was broken, justice rolling forward, but Ahioka knew the fight for truth would never fully end, Nakoa's memory urging her to keep going. With Amos's trial behind them, Ahioka rallied the village to rebuild, her hands calloused as she helped raise new teepees, their frames sturdy against the wind. Lila planned a feast to unite the tribe, her voice bright as she called for music and shared meals. "We're stronger now," she said, passing Ahioka a bowl of stew. Hawk trained young warriors, his laughter echoing as he taught them to aim true. Ahioka set aside resources for a fund to aid trafficking victims, her heart full as she wrote letters to nearby towns for support. A bundle of replies arrived, grateful words from women she'd helped free, their thanks easing her lingering pain. The village thrived, fields greener, and children louder, a testament to their resilience. Ahioka stood at the village's edge, the plains stretching wide, and felt a quiet peace settle in her bones. The tribe was reborn, and she stood firm, ready to lead them forward. Ahioka gathered the village to honor Nakoa, her voice steady as she shared his bravery with wide-eyed children. She knelt by a fire recounting his stand against Marcus. Lila unveiled a carved stone figure of Nakoa, its lines proud in the village center. Hawk led a prayer, his chant low and reverent, binding the tribe in memory. Ahioka laid wild flowers at the spot where Nakoa fell, her fingers tracing the earth. "You're still here," she whispered, feeling his strength in her heart. The villagers vowed to uphold his legacy, their voices rising as one. Nakoa's spirit lingered, a guiding light for Ahioka's path. Clara returned to the village, her steps sure, her face brighter than Ahioka remembered. She hugged Ahioka tightly, whispering, "You saved me." Ahioka invited her to stay, and Clara agreed, teaching children to sew, her laughter filling the air. She shared her story of survival, inspiring the young. Ahioka and Clara grew close, their bond a quiet strength. Clara chose to remain, finding a home among the Cheyenne. The smuggling ring lay in ruins, its network of greed and cruelty shattered by Ahioka's relentless fight. Marcus rotted in a cell, his empire of lies exposed, while Thomas's name faded into the shame of a prison far from the plains. Amos, stripped of his rank, faced a life behind bars, his complicity in the trade a stain no title could wash away. Ahioka stood among the Cheyenne, her heart steady as she built a new life, no longer Rachel but fully Ahioka, a woman forged in fire. She walked the village paths, helping to mend tipis, plant crops and teach children, her hands busy with the work of hope. Nakoa's sacrifice burned bright in her memory, his final words echoing each time she faced a challenge. "Keep fighting," he'd said, and she did, his courage a spark that lit her path and inspired the tribe to stand tall against any threat. The Cheyenne flourished, their fields lush, their laughter loud, their unity a beacon of justice that drew allies from across the plains. Ahioka often climbed a hill at dawn, her cloak catching the wind as she looked to the horizon, the vast sky a canvas of possibility. "This is freedom," she whispered, her voice soft but sure, knowing it came only because she dared to rise against the darkness. The village became a symbol, its story whispered in towns and camps, a testament to the power of standing up no matter the cost. Ahioka's gaze lingered on the distant peaks, her heart full of Nakoa's strength, Clara's friendship, and the tribe's trust. Justice had won, but Nakoa's loss left a quiet scar, a reminder of the price paid. She stepped forward, ready for whatever lay ahead, the future hers to shape.